Hello and welcome to Dialogue. Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida has just concluded his two-day visit to South Korea. The trip is seen as a resumption of shuttle diplomacy between the two neighbors. But at the same time, South Korea's main opposition party, Democratic Party, and representatives of civic groups organized a protest against Kishida's visit to Seoul, the first by a Japanese Prime Minister in 5 years. What tops the agenda for both sides, and why had such a meeting divided South Korean society? And what does the current state of Japan-South Korea ties mean for this region? To discuss these and more, I'm glad to be joined today by Professor Zha Daojiong from Peking University, Professor Robert Kelly from the Department of Political Science at Pusan National University, and Benoit Hardy-Chartrand, adjunct professor at Temple University, Japan. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to Dialogue. Professor Zha, so people say so far we are not 100% clear of the progress of the achievements by the two leaders. But with the visit, people would say it's a resumption of shuttle diplomacy. Tell us more about that, why shuttle diplomacy is so important between two countries, and what does the resumption mean for both sides?
Well, in terms of geographical distance, Seoul and Tokyo are really close. So in other words, a normal city wouldn't have such visits featured in the news. The leaders can come and go on any daily basis, even with the COVID situation in the past 3 years. So the fact that this is resuming 5 years afterwards speaks a lot. And as we know, South Korea has had a change of president. And in the Japanese case, Mr. Kishida assumed office earlier, but there was also a change of leadership in Japan. And as is always the case, in both Korea and in Japan, the change of prime ministership means a lot in terms of the routine contacts between the two governments. So I think it's a reflection of the changes in the domestic context for both countries.
Do you see the change of governments in both countries as the main drivers for the two countries getting closer?
Oh, yes, especially for the South Korean side, because you have different political parties, you have different beliefs, and South Korea has a one-term presidency, and that does mean that each leader has to, quote-unquote, get it right to honor his or her campaign promises. And this is very different from other systems. And in the case of Japan, it's always rather sensitive, and the political leaders, although mainly they come from the same party, but nevertheless, there are also different factions within the LDP, the main party in power in Japan for several decades. So yeah, that's the personality change means a lot in those contexts.
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, there are. We understand that there are, stumbling blocks for resuming or restoring a normal relationship between the two countries, and the historical issue is one of them, the forced labor, for example. And President Yoon from South Korea has made it clear, and actually several occasions, saying that history or controversial history should not be allowed to prevent South Korea from seeking closer ties with Japan. And his personally, people would say he's more pro the U.S. He strengthened ties with the U.S., strengthened ties with Japan. So then of course there's opposition from the opposition parties, from the civic groups, the organized protests, seeing this kind of behavior. They find it hard to accept. We see a divided opinions actually inside South Korea. How much will that kind of opinion affect probably policy making if not inside his administration, maybe in the future?
Well, the arrangement that was announced shortly before the visit, that is, South Korea would accept the Japanese corporations setting up a particular fund, and that fund would, in some ways, pay to the claimants in South Korean society. This is a huge, it's a sea change from the attitude of or the position of the South Korean government during the previous administration. What's really at issue is for many South Koreans, they would say, well, this is still not the final resolution, because what many South Koreans demand is admission, more than admission of guilt. They would demand sovereign responsibility. And we have had numerous cases in the past decades when South Korean companies, the families of the victims, civic groups, take the issues to court, both in Korea and in Japan, and routinely on the Japanese side, the Japanese court system ruled that the Japanese government or the state would have no responsibility. So to what extent the current arrangement can last, we don't know. Again, going back to what I said, you have a one-term presidency, and that issue of history, and in a more material sense today, it will have to do more with compensation to the families. This issue may not have been put to final rest yet.
Okay. So we have Professor Robert Kelly on the line. Robert, what's the response from South Korea right now since the trip by the Japanese Prime Minister has concluded to the country? So what's the response from the government and from the public?
Yeah, I think your other guest there really nailed it. The issue really is a partisan divide, which is to say that supporters of the government and supporters of the government are broadly positive on this, which is to say South Korean conservatives. The conservative press is broadly comfortable with it. I think the conservative press was hoping the Japanese would give a little bit more so that it would be easier to sell the deal to the South Korean public. But as the other guest just mentioned there, right, South Korean public is pretty skeptical, and the South Korean opposition is implacably hostile to this, which I think was to be expected. And I'm surprised how little space the Japanese have given to the Koreans on this. It's going to be difficult for Yoon to sell this at home. South Korean public opinion is negative on the deal. It's something like 60% or more don't like it. And also the South Korean President Yoon isn't making much of an effort to sell the deal, which kind of surprises me too, right? So the Japanese aren't helping much, and South Korean president isn't really arguing for it very much. He's not doing like a big speaking tour or talking about this or something. He just kind of did it and is moving on. And so I'm actually fairly skeptical this is going to last. I think whenever the South Korean left, the progressives take the presidency again, this deal will probably fall apart. It's a democracy, right? And you got to have public support, and the public just doesn't really like it very much.
Mm-hmm. Well, Robert, I think you're referring to probably partly to this the historical issue. People
Sure.
say, in South Korea, there's expectation that Prime Minister Kishida could do more in terms of,
Right.
let's say, making a proper apology for historical
Right.
issues, the brutal history, when during the colonial times. But he just said that his heart hurts when he thinks of the suffering and pain during that period of time. So you mentioned about probably that's the lack of trust or lack of confidence from the Japanese side.
Yeah, I think the big problem here in South Korea is that the public wants more from the Japanese. They want sort of these expressions of contrition on a regular basis too, right? I mean, one of the things the Japanese say is that we've said this 20 times already. Why do we have to keep saying it? The South Koreans want them to keep saying it, and this is actually one of the problems here, right? Is there's a discussion about like how much is enough, and whatever the Japanese think they've done enough, the South Koreans don't, right? But I think what the Japanese are missing here is that they don't add these kinds of apologies to these things. These deals just aren't going to survive. I mean, we know that they won't because this is what happened to the Comfort Women deal from, what was that, I think 6 or 7 years ago, right? With the previous conservative president, before the last liberal president, struck a deal on another wartime-related issue with Japan. And as soon as the progressives took the presidency, that deal fell apart. And so I think it's very easy to predict that when the current conservative president, Yoon, leaves office, if his successor is a progressive, is a liberal, which is possible, right? I mean, they're they poll well, then this deal will fall apart. And I'm really surprised, again, sort of thinking domestically here in South Korea, I'm very surprised the Yoon government is making so little effort to sell the deal. I mean, they're just not arguing for it. They're not writing papers about it. They're not giving speeches about it. I mean, it's just they did it and moved on, and that's just not going to work. I mean, it's just not going to last. So I'm just pretty surprised.
But the Japanese side, they did make some, let's say, concessions. For example, they will allow experts from South Korea to inspect the water, or contaminated water from Fukushima nuclear power plant, the discharge. And also they will include South Korea into this white list of a preferred trading partner. So basically ending this years of trade war, 5 years, about 5 years. So that's some solid progress, can we say so?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty good, right? I mean, the Japanese had to do something, and we know the Americans, there's been some leaks that suggest the Americans were pushing the Japanese to do more. The Biden administration has sort of been involved on the sides on this pushing. But again, the real issue is the historical issues. That's what really moves the South Korean public. And most importantly, I think, for the selling the deal in South Korea, the historical issues are really what the South Korean opposition party really wants movement on. I mean, they're really, really hung up on this. It's a big, big issue for the South Korean left. And so, Fukushima and a few other things on the side, that's just, honestly, I just don't think it's enough. Maybe. I mean, I think Yoon's thinking, this issue isn't that important because, China and the Ukraine war and North Korea, I think that's the logic on the conservative side. But I just don't think the South Korean left shares that kind of geostrategic read of the region, that they need Japan, and so they have to sort of accept Japan not making apologies. I don't think the South Korean left believes that strategic logic.
Professor Zha, taking into consideration of this, divisiveness on sensitive historical issues inside South Korea, and also, President Yoon's rather low approval rate of around 30%. So do you think the meeting between Prime Minister Kishida and President Yoon can reshape the bilateral ties, let's say, bearing probably over their differences, historical differences and other differences on other issues, so they can, probably work together as expected in Washington, let's say?
Well, you asked a very heavily loaded set of questions. I would think what's really significant is the resumption of normalcy in trade ties. I believe it was about 2017. We have to double check the date, when Japan reacted to South Korea. I think it was also history-related issues so angrily that Japan terminated export of a particular type of glue for the South Korean semiconductor companies to use. Thereafter, the South Korean companies found a replacement material for that. And so in some ways, you can say the resumption of the normal trade ties, or what's called the white list, is a mutual learning on both sides, especially for the Japan side. And, that leads to a second point about the U.S. factor. The U.S. is pressuring both, or asking, or consulting both Tokyo and Seoul over the realignment of semiconductor chains, especially here in the region in relation to China. So that actually puts Japanese and the Korean companies into a different kind of competition. To what extent this resumption of trade ties, especially in the high-tech sector, can help address those kind of new market-level competition, not necessarily for the China market, but for the rest of the global supply chains. That remains to be seen. But nevertheless, we have to put into perspective. The United States can try and say, well, tell Tokyo and say should go and find a way to mend ties with South Korea, or they can tell the South Koreans likewise. But at the end of the day, the U.S. has never been short of trying to do that. And the Biden administration probably found one of those so-called keys to the issue that's the semiconductors, but not just history, but even with strategic issues, North Korea or what they would call East Asian context, that's a euphemism for the so-called China challenge. I would think Japanese and the South Korean calculations are still very, very fundamentally rooted in domestic calculations rather than the demand from Washington or preference from Washington.
Mm-hmm. We'll be back to this, topic, basically the role of the U.S. and the fact of China here. But before that, we have Benoit also on the line. Welcome to the show, Benoit. So, the trip has finished. What's the response? What's the media coverage in Japan?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for having me on the show. The media coverage so far has been fairly positive. There's really been generally positive comments ever since March when we saw the first visit of President Yoon of South Korea to Japan. And on both sides, there was clear commitment to bring back the relationship, to bring back some normalcy, a sense of normalcy to this relationship. And now with this second bilateral summit in less than 2 months, there is a clear sense, at least in Japan, that this shuttle diplomacy is going to resume now, just like it was up until around 12 years ago. And it is perceived in Japan as a very positive development because in Japan for many years now, there was a sense of fatigue regarding these constant recriminations on the part of South Korea, these demands for more apologies on the part of Japan. So when the new South Korean President Yoon was elected about 2 years ago, now there's some clear momentum towards resumption of the shuttle diplomacy. So now clearly we are starting a new trend, a new era, at least for the short term, between the two countries, which is going to make it a lot easier in the case of Japan and also the United States to coordinate all three countries' approaches to their shared security concerns in the region.
Mm-hmm. Well, Benoit, we earlier mentioned about the lack of a proper apology, probably from Prime Minister Kishida. What's the Japanese understanding, basically, for South Koreans? I would say for at least some of them, the historical issue is almost like a part of their identity of being South Korean. I mean, this is important, critically important to them, the
Absolutely.
Historical issue. But why it is so difficult, or why Japan is reluctant to issue, let's say, a proper apology?
Yeah, so that's a great question, because it is true that, as I'm sure the other guests have pointed out before I came on, that there is this lingering anti-Japanese sentiment in South Korea. Surveys show that very clearly. And every time there is a rapprochement between the two sides, public opinion in South Korea makes it very well known that it is it has some reservations regarding this rapprochement. Now, in the case of Japan, the feeling is that the overwhelming feeling, not only within the political elite, but also within the population, is that these apologies have been made several times in the past. And if you look historically, it is true that Japanese politicians, Japanese at the highest level historically, have made several statements of apologies. And this is why there is this sense of fatigue that I mentioned earlier. Now, the issue with these statements is that while many of these statements were seemingly very sincere in terms of the contents of these apologies, the issue was that from the perspective of South Korea, and you could extend that as well to China, is a lot of these apologies were a little bit too broad. And on top of that, you often have Japanese politicians, after these apologies are made, that seem to backtrack on these apologies. They seem to hint at these apologies being forced out of them. There was a report, for example, a few years ago that said that some of the wording and some of the previous apologies have been a result of negotiations with South Korea. So all of these things basically point to, in the eyes of South Korea, to these apologies being not exactly as sincere as they should be. So that's why there is, in the case of South Korea, repeated demands for greater apologies. And in the case of Japan, the sense that these apologies have been made repeatedly and enough, and that we should be able to overcome these historical differences.
A trust issue, or rather a lack of trust here. Robert,
Exactly.
In a news story carried by Bloomberg, it sees the meeting between the two leaders, the Japanese and the Korean leaders, as a move, potentially against China, saying that,
Right.
quote, rare Japan-South Korea summit could help U.S. push on China. At the same time, of course, we know, both governments seem to be aware that China is their largest trading partner, and there's a need to balance. So how far do you think they will go in supporting the U.S. probably in its geopolitical competition with China?
Yeah, that's actually, I think, the motivation on the Yoon side of the equation, right? I think as the others have mentioned, I think the South Korean left is simply more willing to sort of find a modus vivendi with China and sort of not line up for a kind of Cold War with the United States and Japan, against China. The South Korean left is much more comfortable sort of negotiating with China and sort of trying to find some kind of way to sort of like live with it and sort of accommodate its differences and whatever. And a part of this is because they want China to help with North Korea. The South Korean right is much more traditional. The South Korean right tends to read North Korea and China as sort of dictatorships, and they're menacing. And so we should sort of be lined up with the Americans. And if that means we have to get along better with the Japanese, well, then just so be it. We have to do that because we're in this geopolitical bind. And I think that's really the logic that you're getting from the Yoon administration, is that, look, I mean, the Japanese did this stuff and it was bad, 100 years ago. Yoon actually said this, right? They did this stuff 100 years ago, but it's 100 years since. And, we can't keep talking about that. I mean, he got crucified for saying that by the progressive press, but he said that, right? And I think that really illustrates the really deep partisan divide in South Korea on foreign policy, right? The left and the right in South Korea are very far apart in how they think they should address particularly North Korea, but by extension also China and the United States. And South Korean conservatives are just comfortable lining up with Japan and saying, China is sort of a menace because of Taiwan and everything else. And the South Korean left is just not going to do that, right? And so my prediction for the future is that as the South Korean presidency moves back and forth between right and left, you're going to see big swings in South Korean foreign policy, because that replicates the deep divide in the South Korean public about how to respond to the region's challenges.
Robert, beside these ideological differences, of course, between China and South Korea, there are some people, they are questioning the wisdom of South Korean, the president, let's say, being at the forefront of a U.S.-China rivalry, and warned of being, the direct victim of China-U.S. fight. Do you think is there a concern about that, realistically?
Yeah, most of it, I think, as your other guests have pointed out, is related to trade. But I just saw a report today in South Korea where they expect the United States is going to become South Korea's biggest trading partner in the future, right? I mean, the more sort of the U.S. and China sort of collide, the more states around the U.S. and China, right, caught in the middle, right, the Philippines, Vietnam, and so on, are going to face decision forks, and they're going to end up choosing one way or the other. I think this is really unfortunate. I've said this many times on this program in the past, but I mean, the more it becomes a zero-sum game in these days between the U.S. and China, the more states are going to take sides. The Japanese have already made it very clear which side they'll fall on. And in time, my guess is the sovereignty and strategic issues will trump the trade issues. That's going to be very painful for South Korea, particularly, as you pointed out, right, because the costs are going to be pretty high. But I think economic decoupling is going to be driven by strategic rivalry. I think it'll take a while. It's not going to happen in a year or two. But I think that's coming, and I think Yoon is already comfortable with that. I mean, I've been at conferences in Korea where people are saying that already, that we have to sort of start to draw away because of the rivalry. And so, yeah, I think that's coming.
Professor Zha, of course, later this year, South Korea will be hosting this three-nation summit, Japan, South Korea, China, as a regular summit between the three countries. And earlier, there's, I think it's the trade minister from South Korea talking about the importance for the three economies in the role of them in reviving the global economic recovery. So what do you make of that? At the same time, we see there are problems, but they are emphasizing the cooperation economically and trade and investment here between the three countries, let's say.
Well, in some ways, you can say that each of the three, China, Japan, and South Korea, they're walking, quote unquote, on two legs. One leg is for China need to demonstrate its resolve, its independence, its opposition, and a number of core security issues. And sometimes that does involve, let's say, difficult moments with both South Korea and Japan on core national security issues of China, and then Japan and South Korea likewise. But then the three found a format actually that borrows from ASEAN, the Southeast Association of Southeast Asian countries. In other words, being close neighbors, you do have a huge basket of issues. Many of them are confrontational by nature, but nevertheless, the basket has to be there, and that basket is some routine meetings. I believe the trilateral meeting at the Prime Minister's level of the three countries, China, Japan, and Korea, started in 1999, and that was after the Asian financial crisis. It was regularized, but then stopped a number of years ago. But now the resumption will be at the Prime Minister's level. So for Japan and for South Korea, this can be explained saying, well, it's the working level rather than the head of state level. But then there is something that's missing a lot of times in these media discussions. That is, the governments have always kept a rather fairly low profile working level secretariat of cooperation. The secretariat is actually based in South Korea, in Seoul. It came up with a creative name for the Trilateral Cooperation Center, and it's quite good. In other words, you would have all these high-flying differences. You would probably, in some ways, you can say, both, especially in Japan and this time in South Korea, they would be responding to calls from Washington, D.C., but nevertheless, there's that bare minimum of contacts and cooperation on common issues among the three.
Mm-hmm. Oh, Benoit, finally, obviously, I mean, the economic importance can be felt for the three countries in particular. Like Japan, for example, given its economy, I think in 2021 or 2022, like a 0.2% economic growth, there's a need, I guess, to not only develop domestically, but also with important trading partners like South Korea, like China here.
No, absolutely. The Japanese economy, as many economies in the region, was battered by the pandemic. And now, since then, there's certainly a greater impetus for the government of Japan to increase its trade ties with its neighbors. Now, one of the issues, of course, is the trade tensions and the moves towards partial decoupling between the United States and China is certainly having an impact as well on Japan, and that has an impact as well on other economies in the region. So it remains to be seen what direction this is going to go. We've already seen the Japanese government over the last couple of years offering, for example, subsidies to Japanese companies to move away from the Chinese market. But so far, we have not seen many Japanese companies move away because they continue to see the Chinese market as a lucrative, as a positive market, as an important market to be present in. So I don't expect that to change very much in the next few years. And now that most of the pandemic measures have been lifted in all countries, we can expect trade to soar back to something that's similar to pre-pandemic levels.
Well, on that note, we conclude today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.